The Civil War was the biggest war in U.S. history. That's really saying something when you consider how much we love fighting wars. It was also a war where the U.S. was on the right side of history, which is not saying much considering we were fighting ourselves, making us on the wrong side of history at the same time. Nonetheless, the side that won, the North, fought for the noble cause of ending slavery. But it didn't start that way. When the war started in April of 1861, President Abraham Lincoln made it clear that the North's cause was to save the Union, to keep the United States united and not fractured into northern and southern parts. While Lincoln personally hated slavery, he knew the rest of his countrymen would never follow him into a war to end it. Racist attitudes in the North were too strong. However, things were changing by 1863. Thousands of white Northern soldiers had marched through the South, where they saw slavery up close for the first time, and they were horrified. Thousands of black people, enslaved and free, bravely helped the North fight the war. These experiences started to soften racial attitudes in the North. Lincoln sensed that people would accept ending slavery and saving the Union as twin causes for which to fight, as long as ending slavery helped the North win the war and save the Union. Personally, he felt ending slavery was the least he could do for a people willing to save the country he so dearly loved. In January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended slavery in rebel territory. It technically didn't free a single slave, but it was the first step the federal government had ever taken to end slavery in areas where it already existed. It was a sign that if the Union was saved, it would be a Union without slavery. In November of that same year, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, in which he promised a new birth of freedom if the North won. By 1864, everyone understood that the war to save the Union was now also a moral crusade against slavery. The main questions were, how would the North win? What needed to be done to bring this war to a close? What price was the North willing to pay? These questions would be answered between 1864 and 1865. We look upon Abraham Lincoln now as an American saint, a towering figure in American history both literally and figuratively. However, at the start of 1864, he was widely hated throughout the country. Southerners, of course, hated him from the start, but Northerners hated him too. Abolitionists, the people who opposed slavery, believed he was too accommodating to slave owners. Northerners who just wanted to win the war and go back to normal saw him as an incompetent wartime president who dragged the war out longer than necessary. Northerners who just wanted to let the South leave the Union saw him as a warmonger. Northerners of all stripes disliked how he suspended civil liberties, like the writ of habeas corpus, which allowed him to throw people in jail without trial. He couldn't please anyone. This was bad news in 1864, which was the year he was up for re-election. His chances didn't look good. Not only was he unpopular, but his Democratic opponent in 1864 was the wildly popular General George McClellan. McClellan was the man Lincoln appointed to head the Army of the Potomac in 1861, the U.S.'s main army during the Civil War. He built a name for himself as an able administrator, beloved by his troops. He was the hero of the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history. The fact he was a loser in most of his other battles he led is why Lincoln fired him. Now, McClellan had a plan to get Lincoln fired from his job. He ran as the candidate who would end the Civil War. If elected, he promised he would negotiate peace with the South. which meant he would recognize the South as its own independent country. Yes, this would destroy the United States as people knew it, but it would also bring peace, which everyone at the time could support. The combination of Lincoln's unpopularity and McClellan's promise of peace made McClellan and the Democrats the favorites to win the election of 1864. Lincoln and the Republicans would need a miracle to win. That miracle was set in motion by Lincoln's most brilliant and loyal general, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi in July 1863, giving the North control of the Mississippi River, the South's main waterway. It also split the Confederacy in half. Grant then turned his attention to controlling the South's main railways. This is when his brilliant young protege, William Tecumseh Sherman, got his chance to shine. He sent Sherman and his army into Tennessee to take the South's major rail hub there, the city of Chattanooga. Without waterways or railways, the South would not be able to move men or supplies to the theaters of war that needed them. Sherman gained control of Chattanooga, then led his men to help a Union army that was in trouble at Knoxville. After that, he turned south to tear up rail lines in Mississippi. At this point, President Lincoln promoted Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General, a title that had only been held by George Washington before him. This made Grant the head of the entire Union Army. He was summoned eastward to break Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. Before he left for Virginia, he put Sherman in charge of the army in the West, leaving him on his own to deal with Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. So Sherman based himself in Chattanooga and planned the war in the West. His plan was to march south from Chattanooga into Georgia to destroy the Confederate armies there. All the while, he'd keep Chattanooga in his rear as a resupply station. The terrain in northern Georgia was rough. The Confederates bent but did not break. Instead, they slowly retreated south, closer to their resupply center, the city of Atlanta. Atlanta had grown into the largest Confederate city during the war. It was far away from the heavy fighting going on in places like Virginia. Because of its relative isolation, it became the center of Southern manufacturing. People fled there to escape violence and get jobs. It was the heartland of the Confederacy, the last safe haven for the South. By the middle of the summer of 1864, General Sherman had arrived at Atlanta's doorstep. On the morning of September 2nd, the people of Atlanta were awakened by a huge explosion. It was Confederate General John Bell Hood blowing up all of his ammunition before leaving the city so that General Sherman would not have access to it. Later that day, Sherman sent a letter to President Abraham Lincoln informing him, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." Sherman's capture of Atlanta had major psychological effects on both the North and the South. The South lost its biggest city and manufacturing base. It was a sign that there was no safe haven from the war. To the North, it was proof that they were winning. Victory was within reach. There was light at the end of the tunnel. Nobody was happier about Sherman's capture of Atlanta than President Lincoln. The timing was perfect. The election was 2 months away. People would be more likely to vote for him if they believed the war was drawing to a close. Come Election Day, Lincoln handily defeated George McClellan. It was Lincoln's redemption. It showed that the country approved of his prosecution of the war. They were willing to stick it out a little longer if it meant saving the Union and ending slavery. Just 4 short years earlier, Lincoln had to go out of his way to reassure Northerners that he did not want to end slavery. It was the only way he can get elected. When the Civil War started, he had to reassure the North again that they were fighting to save the Union and not end slavery. It was the only way he can get men to volunteer for the army. But now, the country had overwhelmingly reelected him, knowing he intended to end slavery. Lincoln and the country had changed together. They grew to accept that slavery was the great moral issue of the day. The Southern desire to keep slavery had started the war. The North's desire to abolish slavery would end the war. But when the war would end would be decided on the battlefield. While Grant chased Lee around Virginia, Sherman prepared to chase the Southern armies in the West. There was just one problem. Where were the Southern armies? They had no more supply bases. Chattanooga and Atlanta were in Sherman's hands. They were turned loose in the Southern wilderness, where Sherman would have to find them and beat them. This would not be easy. Sherman's men not only had to defend Chattanooga, they also had to defend every inch of rail line that came out of Chattanooga if they wanted to keep getting supplies. One Confederate general in particular was determined to make this impossible: the Tennessean Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest's men prowled the backcountry of Tennessee and northern Georgia. They popped out of the wilderness, ambushed Sherman's men on the rail lines, and then disappeared back into the wilderness. It was a brutal form of guerrilla war designed to make it impossible for Sherman to defend his supply lines. Forrest would gain infamy in American history after the war when he helped found an organization of ex-Confederate soldiers. These ex-soldiers would dress as ghosts to commemorate the Southerners who died during the war. You guessed it, Forrest went on to be the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. But without supply lines, what would Sherman do? He outlined his strategy in a telegram to General Grant in October. It will be impossible to protect this road now that Hood, Forrest, and Wheeler and the whole batch of devils are turned loose without home or habitation. Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy, but utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. By attempting to hold the roads, we will lose 1,000 men monthly and will gain no result. I can make the march and make Georgia howl. We have over 8,000 cattle and 3 million pounds of bread, but no corn. But we could forage the interior of the state. In other words, his plan was to abandon his supply line back to Chattanooga to avoid Forrest's raids. Instead, his army would get supplies from the Georgia countryside. He would take what he needed from southern plantations and southern stores. What his men couldn't take or use, they would destroy. Farms would be burned to the ground. Rail lines would be uprooted and bent around tree trunks in what came to be called Sherman neckties. Not only would his men eat from the South's natural bounty, but he would also make sure that the South couldn't eat from it. It wasn't just a war of army versus army. It was a war on infrastructure and the people behind the lines who supported the enemy. It was total war. Sherman figured that the main Confederate forces under General Hood were falling back to the city of Savannah, Georgia on the Atlantic Ocean. He carved a path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah that struck terror in the hearts of all Southerners. In November, he wrote a letter to Union General Phil Sheridan. I am satisfied and have been all the time that the problem of this war consists in the awful fact that the present class of men who rule the South must be killed outright. Sherman predicted his own march to Savannah 4 years earlier, before the war even started. He wrote a letter during the secession wave that came over the South in the winter of 1860-61 to a Louisiana professor, warning him of the consequences of a civil war. You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right at your doors. You are bound to fail. Now all that Sherman had prophesied before the war started coming true by his own hand. Everything between Atlanta and Savannah was destroyed. As Sherman famously said at one point, "War is hell, and he made sure this was the case for the people of Georgia. He arrived in Savannah in December. On the 20th, the Confederate general defending the city, William Hardee, escaped. On December 21st, Sherman telegraphed President Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition and about 25,000 bales of cotton." Sherman prepared for the next phase of the war. He planned to march north through South Carolina, the state that started this whole mess, with the goal of linking up with General Grant in Virginia to help him roll up Lee's army once and for all. But before he left Georgia, there was one issue he had to attend to. During his march to Savannah, thousands of slaves had left their plantations to follow his army to freedom. He would not be able to bring these hopeful human beings with him into South Carolina. There simply wasn't enough food for both them and his army. So, in January 1865, Sherman issued his Special Field Order Number 15. It called for the land in Georgia the North had conquered, including the sea islands off the coast of Georgia, to be redistributed to the former slaves. Each family would receive 40-acre plots of land, or, as it was said later, 40 acres and a mule. That way, they could feed themselves and take ownership of the land their families had worked for generations. Some 40,000 former slaves were settled on land in Georgia. Unfortunately, they did not get to keep that land for long. After the war, white plantation owners returned to drive them off the land with the blessing of a new president, the Tennessean Andrew Johnson. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the main Confederate army under Robert E. Lee was holding on for dear life. After getting thrashed at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Lee was not strong enough to launch an attack on a Northern army again. His best hope was to keep the war going until the election of 1864, in which he hoped McClellan would win and then recognize the Confederacy as an independent country. When McClellan did not win, his only hope was to keep the war going until the North got tired and went home. Considering the string of loser generals the North sent to fight him throughout the war, it made sense for Lee to think this was possible. Towards the beginning of the war, George McClellan could have wiped them out at Antietam, but was too timid to do so. After Lincoln fired McClellan, he hired a parade of failures who did no better than McClellan: Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, and George Meade. When Grant took over responsibilities in Virginia, Lee had no reason to think he would be any different than the others. And he was dead wrong. Grant had what those other generals didn't have: a killer's spirit. Other generals were careful where and when they attacked for fear of losing too many men in battle. Grant had no such concern. He knew the North outnumbered the South more than 2-1. Even if the North lost double the amount of men in battle than the South, they could still win the war. This was the philosophy behind what Grant called his Overland Campaign. Grant would attack Lee with overwhelming force and, if Lee escaped, attack him again before he had a chance to regroup. All the while, Lee would be backed closer and closer to the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, where he would have nowhere else to run and be forced to surrender. But getting to Richmond would be hell. Grant's way of waging war cost him many men, way more than armies in Virginia were accustomed to losing. At the Battle of Cold Harbor in the spring of 1864, for example, Grant lost almost 13,000 men of a total force of 100,000. Half of those men died in the first 30 minutes of battle. Meanwhile, Lee lost between 2,000 and 5,000 men from a force of 55,000. It was a battlefield loss for Grant and solidified his reputation in the North as a butcher. At the same time, it weakened Lee's beleaguered army and forced him to limp back in the direction of Richmond, which was all part of Grant's strategy. By March of 1865, the noose was tightening around Lee. Not only was he pushed back into Richmond, But Grant had waged the same type of total war against him that Sherman was waging in Georgia. Grant sent General Phil Sheridan into the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of Virginia from which Lee's men had been getting their food, to burn it down. With a force of 3,000 men, Sheridan killed 5,000 cattle, destroyed over 200 barns, and burned almost 700 kilograms of grain in what was called the Burning Raid, or just the burning. Meanwhile, Grant controlled all the rail lines into Richmond to ensure that his men would be resupplied. Lee was not only up against a much larger force, but now his men started to starve. Southern soldiers started to abandon the army just to find something to eat, or to find out if they still had a home to go to. On April 9th, 1865, Lee met with Grant at the town of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia to discuss terms of surrender. Grant was generous to the Confederates. He let them keep their horses and their property if they agreed never to rebel against the government again. In the days leading up to the meeting at Appomattox, Grant met with President Lincoln, who encouraged him to treat the Confederates fairly. In Lincoln's mind, they were all countrymen again. He was their president again. They needed to put the war behind them and reunite. Grant faithfully followed Lincoln's orders. Lincoln visited the city of Richmond, which was burning down around him. Formerly enslaved people came up to embrace him. Some knelt in front of him and thanked him for their freedom. Lincoln replied that the thanks belongs to God alone. As we will see, God played a major role in Lincoln's thought process in the closing days of the war. He visited the mansion of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who had already fled the city. Lincoln sat in Jeff Davis's chair and imagined what the war was like for him. It was a moment of triumph for Lincoln and of sadness. He won the war. The Union was saved. Slavery was over. But what did the future hold? Unfortunately, the Civil War had one last life to claim. As we said earlier, Lincoln had changed since he won his first election in 1860. The Abraham Lincoln of 1860 danced around the issue of slavery, saying he had no intention of interfering with it where it already existed. It was the only way he could survive as a politician in those tense times. By the time the South surrendered in April of 1865, Lincoln was convinced that slavery was America's original sin and the Civil War was punishment for that sin. He clearly outlined this idea in his second inaugural speech. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. God's judgment was also weighing on his mind when it came to the issue of prisoners of war, or POWs. In war, when a soldier surrenders to the enemy, they become the prisoner of the enemy. Usually, prisoners are sent to camps deep in enemy territory where they are fed and taken care of while under guard. In the North, the main prison for Southern POWs was in upstate New York at Elmira. In the South, the main prison for Northern POWs was in Andersonville, in Georgia. Most of the time, the two sides at war negotiate to release some prisoners they hold in exchange for some prisoners held by the other side. Prisoner of war exchanges are common throughout all wars up until today. Unfortunately, prisoner of war exchanges broke down towards the end of the Civil War. When the South took Northern prisoners of war, they separated black prisoners from white prisoners. They classified captured black soldiers not as prisoners, but as contrabands, which meant confiscated property. The South used black prisoners as slaves, whether they had been slaves before the war or not. When they exchanged POWs with the North, they only released white soldiers and kept the black ones in slavery. Towards the end of the war, Lincoln refused to exchange any prisoners of war with the South until they released black soldiers along with white soldiers. In other words, he was prepared to consider black soldiers as equal to white soldiers. And why not? Had black soldiers not also fought in the war? Were they not entitled to the same treatment as anyone else who fought in the war? Lincoln followed this train of thought to its ultimate conclusion. If black soldiers were equal to white soldiers, did they not also deserve equal rights? The right to vote even? When I was growing up, I usually had two types of teachers. Ones who said, Lincoln freed the slaves, or ones who said, Lincoln didn't give a damn about the slaves. Neither of those statements is accurate. First, Lincoln didn't free the slaves. The slaves freed themselves through centuries of resistance, with the Civil War being the final act of that resistance. Second, Lincoln did give a damn about the slaves, and that damn got bigger as the war went on. He changed, he grew as a person, and he learned. Lincoln in 1865 was a different man from Lincoln in 1860. His stance on the POWs showed this. The South refused to release black POWs, so Lincoln did not exchange any towards the end of the war. POW camps on both sides started filling up with prisoners. No POWs suffered more than the northern POWs being held in Andersonville, Georgia. Not only were they imprisoned in tents out in the hot Georgia sun, but the Confederacy just stopped feeding them after a while. All of the South's crops were burning. Food was on short supply in the South, and they certainly weren't going to use the little food they had to feed northern POWs. And there were more and more POWs to feed as the war dragged on. The suffering was immense. Northern POWs started taking on the appearance of walking skeletons. The families of these POWs blamed Lincoln. They believed their loved ones would have been released if it wasn't for Lincoln insisting that black POWs be treated equally. He was accused of favoring black people over whites, of coddling the black man. Lincoln was heartbroken over the suffering happening at Andersonville. He carried a photograph of an Andersonville POW with him everywhere he went to remind him of the suffering. It would have been easy for him to just exchange the white POWs and leave it at that, but he knew God was watching, and God would not approve of him abandoning his black countrymen. The end of the Civil War settled the issue once and for all. The POWs would be exchanged. 3 days after the South surrendered, Lincoln spoke to a crowd of people from a window in the White House. He called for the country to reunite. He suggested that black people be given the right to vote, at least ones who were quote-unquote very intelligent, showing he was not totally there yet when it came to seeing the races as equals. In the crowd that night listening to the speech was an actor from Maryland named John Wilkes Booth. After the speech, Booth turned to a friend and said, "That is the last speech he'll ever give." Booth and a group of his pro-Confederate friends had been meeting in a house in Washington, D.C. for the past several months to work out a plan to kidnap President Lincoln and exchange him for Southern POWs. The Confederate government probably was not in on the kidnapping plot, although they had been hatching kidnapping plots of their own anyway. The end of the war made kidnapping Lincoln unnecessary. However, Lincoln's support for giving black people the right to vote may have convinced Booth to turn his kidnapping plot into an assassination plot. It is important to note that Booth was not some two-bit actor. He was a famous stage actor from an illustrious acting family. It would be like Tom Cruise or Denzel Washington planning to assassinate the president today. Booth got mail delivered to him at a local D.C. theater called Ford's Theater. He went to Ford's Theater on the morning of April 14, 1865 to pick up his mail, where he was told that Lincoln and his wife would be attending a play there later that night. The play was called Our American Cousin, a play in which Booth had acted before, an important detail to note for later. Booth told his kidnapping conspiracy buddies that he planned to kill Lincoln that night. He assigned some of his other goons to assassinate other members of the federal government. The goon George Atzerodt was assigned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. The goon Lewis Powell was assigned to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. Other assorted goons were assigned less direct roles in the plot, including coordinating the getaways. When night fell on April 14, 1865, everything was ready to go. They hoped to decapitate the federal government and restart the Civil War on terms more favorable to the South. George Atzerodt, the man designated to kill the vice president, chickened out after a day of heavy drinking. Lewis Powell, the man designated to kill Secretary of State Seward, arrived at Seward's house at around 10 p.m. Seward had gotten into a carriage accident a week earlier, and he was recovering on the second floor of his house, laying in bed in a body cast, unable to move. Powell knocked at the door. Seward's butler answered. Powell told the butler he was sent by Seward's doctor, held up a bottle of medicine, and told the butler he would have to show Seward how to apply the medicine. The butler didn't quite buy the story and told Powell to wait. Powell pushed his way into the house and walked up the stairs to the second floor. At the top of the stairs was Seward's son Frederick, who told Powell to get the hell out of there. Powell stepped back, pulled out a pistol, and shot towards Frederick's head. The pistol misfired. At that moment, Seward's daughter, Fanny, stuck her head out of a bedroom door, yelling for them to keep quiet because her father was trying to rest. This told Powell exactly where Seward was. Powell pistol-whipped Frederick, pulled out a knife, raced into the bedroom where Seward was lying helpless on the bed, pushed Fanny aside, stabbed Seward's army nurse in the arm, and then jumped on top of Seward and stabbed him. Seward was well protected over his body by a cast, but his neck and face were exposed, and that's what got stabbed. Seward's other son, Augustus, came into the room, pulled Powell off his father, and was stabbed for his troubles. Powell then ran out of the house yelling, I'm mad," before getting onto his getaway horse. Seward did not die, but he was permanently disfigured from the attack. So far, Booth's goons had not killed a single person. Abraham and his wife Mary decided to go to the play that night because they hadn't spent much time together during the war. Lincoln was always at the War Department and Mary was always lonely. They had grown apart over the past 4 years. This was their chance to rebuild their relationship. Lincoln attended the play with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and his young fiancée Clara. They would all watch the play from a second-floor balcony at Ford's Theater. Booth entered the theater after the play had already started. He was not scheduled to be there, but he was always welcomed because he was a famous actor who worked there many times before. Nobody questioned his presence. Booth knew every line of the play. He waited for a part of the play where one character called another a sockdologizing old man-trap, which would elicit laughter from the crowd. The laughter would cover the blast from Booth's pistol. As the time drew near, Booth waited at the foot of the stairs that led to the second-floor balcony. Lincoln had bodyguards, but they went across the street for some drinks. Things were a little more lax in these days since no president had yet been assassinated. Booth crept up the stairs and stalked the president from behind. The line in the play came. The audience laughed. Booth fired his shot. The bullet buried itself in the back of Lincoln's head on the left side. Lincoln slumped over unconscious immediately. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone fought with Booth and was stabbed in his arm for his trouble. Booth then jumped onto the rail of the balcony and leapt onto the stage. His boot got caught in the American flag bunting hanging over the side, so he fell awkwardly and broke his leg. He turned to the crowd holding the bloody knife over his head, yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus to tyrants," the state motto of Virginia. The crowd didn't quite know what to make of the scene. Booth hobbled out of the theater onto his getaway horse. Lewis Powell, the man who tried to kill Seward, was caught, put on trial, and executed. The same for George Atzerodt, the man who chickened out from killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. 2 more co-conspirators were also killed. Booth himself ran into the woods of Maryland, where he avoided capture for a week. That's when the army caught up with him, surrounded him, and killed him. Although it's not clear if he died from being shot by the army or from the fire the army had set in the cabin he was staying in. Lincoln's lifeless body was brought across the street to a doctor's house, where he died the next morning. The first president in American history to be assassinated. He immediately became an American saint, a martyr, someone who died for the noble causes of equal rights and saving the Union. He immediately joined the pantheon of heroes next to the likes of George Washington. His body was brought through every major city in the North, where millions of people came out to mourn the death of this American saint. There was a tremendous outpouring of emotion. The president who was so widely hated in the North a year earlier was beloved now. When his body was paraded down the streets of Manhattan, a young boy named Theodore Roosevelt watched from his window. One day, he would go on to be a great president in his own right. Lincoln's was the last death of the Civil War, the final price the country had to pay for its original sin of slavery. Did Lincoln contemplate God so much during those last months of the war because he sensed he would be meeting him soon and would have to account for his actions in front of God? One of the more fascinating pieces of footage from the internet is of the last living witness to the Abraham Lincoln assassination. He went on a game show in the 1950s when he was in his 90s. The fact that we can lay eyes on and hear the voice of a person who was there at the assassination of Lincoln shows the continuity of history. Things that seem so long ago aren't really that long ago.
My name's Samuel J. Seymour. I'm from Maryland.
This is Mr. Seymour from Maryland. And we brought Mr. Seymour all the way up from Maryland, and by golly, he got in a hotel and fell down the steps and gave himself a shiner. And we urged him not to come on the show tonight, as a matter of fact. We finally got in touch with his doctor, and the doctor said it was up to Mr. Seymour. Mr. Seymour said he wouldn't miss it. So here he is, and feeling a party for the rest. Now then, Mr. Seymour, how old are you, by the way, sir?
96.
96 years old.
You witnessed something to do with Abraham Lincoln. Was this a pleasant thing?
Was it a pleasant thing you saw, sir?
Not very pleasant, I don't think. I was
No.
scared to death over it.
He said, no, he was scared to death.
Would it have had anything to do with the President Lincoln's death, by any chance?
Unfortunately, yes.
Did Mr. Seymour witness the shooting of President Lincoln?
We found out about Mr. Seymour through a recent article in the American Weekly, and it said, I saw Lincoln shot. And this article is by Samuel J. Seymour, and it goes on to say that Mr. Seymour was 5 years old at the time. He had been taken to Ford's Theater by some good friends, and the curious thing was that when he was in this youth, 5 years of age, when he saw Booth jump from the box to the stage, at which time he broke his leg, his only concern was not for the president, because he didn't realize the president had been shot, but the poor man who fell out of the balcony. And that's all of his memory is of going to the theater and seeing a man fall out of the balcony. Sir, it's been a great joy and you might say an honor to have you are, by the way, the only living witness of that tragic event.
The Civil War is not ancient history, but relatively recent history. Can we slip down the slope to Civil War again? Slavery is not ancient history either. Have we done enough as a country to atone for our original sin of slavery? Or did we just find new ways to do it? Have we properly faced down our original sin? Or have we spent most of our time whitewashing and downplaying it? These questions are still being answered, and every generation has to answer them for itself.
It's the truth. It's not true. Everything is satisfaction.